Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Dr. Mrinmoy Pramanik. I teach comparative Indian language and literature at the University of Calcutta. Today we'll discuss Translation and India, Unit 4 and Module number 18, Translation and Indian Languages in the Pre-colonial Age. Translation in India is an age-old practice. India is a land of innumerous languages, cultures, and ideas. Most of the linguistic traditions of the world are dominated by oral traditions. India is not an exception. There are so many languages, culture, and communities who survives, expresses themselves through oral mode of communication. Indian people always have their dialogues with other communities. They always have cross-cultural communication and exchanges among different communities. So translation is not only necessary in Indian cultural and social practices, but it is a priori. It is natural. It is born by itself. Communication among different Indian languages is not any phenomena of recent past. It has its age-old history. It is not the British who, for the first time, makes Indians to communicate with each other, but it is pre-colonial practice that people of Bharatvarsha used to have dialogue and used to have communication with each other. It is very much pre-colonial that intellectuals, poets, saints used to travel from one part of India to another. Ancient Indian and medieval texts are necessarily multilingual. If we see the text of plays by Kalidasa, mainly written in Sanskrit, used Sanskrit only as the language of the kings and Brahmins, and simultaneously it used Prakrit as the language of women, servants, and working class people. Such kind of examples show how communication among different languages was already there in India. Pre-colonial period of the history of Indian literature or Indian languages show enormous translation from Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit, Persian, and Arabic. Not only was that translation from one modern Indian language to another already started in medieval period, or more specifically in pre-colonial period. Pre-colonial period also has its crucial significance in formation of modern Indian languages through translation. Translation was most powerful tool to build modern Indian languages in pre-colonial India. This is the time when literature started to be written in modern Indian languages, and translation was showing the path of writing creative literature in different modern Indian languages. We also should remember that this was the time when all the modern Indian languages, which were properly known as Bhasha or Deshi Bhasha or Loko Bhasha, were being formed against the Brahminical hegemony of Sanskrit language, or the language known as Deva Bhasha. This formation of modern Indian languages or Bhasha was a way of emancipation of the people who do not have access to the Sanskrit. Though this emergence of modern Indian languages, local knowledge, oral traditions, folk beliefs, ideas, and philosophies were recorded into a written language. And it is needless to say that translation played most crucial role in this whole project. In the translation culture of pre-colonial India, these are not only the modern Indian languages which were benefited, but it is Sanskrit also which gets its afterlife in different Indian and foreign languages. Sanskrit literature and philosophy also started to be circulated quite well than before. Translational communication among different Indian languages actually enriched each other with literature and philosophy. Sanskrit and Brahminism to some extent lose its hegemony over knowledge, and in other side it reached to the wider audience, and the modern Indian languages what later shaped the identity and whole history of Indian people across the class, caste, religion, culture got enriched with the multiple linguistic and cultural traditions. Now um, we all know that in most of the communities of India, most of the linguistic community, cultural community holds their own ideas, own practices, and own narrative of the great epic called the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. There are multiple readings of these two text, and these two texts have been recreated and retold in different human expressions. Now let us talk about the translation of the Ramayana and Mahabharata into modern Indian languages. I would like to begin with A.K. Ramanujan's famous comment that how many Ramayanas? 300? 3000? At the end of some Ramayanas, a question is sometimes asked, how many Ramayanas have there been? Ramanujan told it in his very celebrated essay 300 Ramayana. This beginning shows innumerous existence of the Ramayana stories in Indian culture or even outside the India. There is no original text of Ramayana, even there are multiple sources of Ram Katha, and from those sources the Ramayanas in different languages are actually written. This observation about the Ramayana or the epic, like the Mahabharata, of almost similar significant status shows that there is a continuity in translating the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, at least in Indian languages. And in every era, the Ramayana or the Mahabharata stories actually increased by means of new interpretation in different forms. Such kind of the translation is retelling the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and this method has been continuing from the ages and will be continued. The Rama stories, the Rama theme, and the stories from the Mahabharata are the common denominator of Indian literary tradition. Either in performance tradition, in orality, or in written forms, these themes and stories of the aforementioned epics exist in different Indian literary culture from the ages. These multiple versions of the grand epic, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, are being continued as a flow in Indian culture, which is actually process of translation. Shishir Kumar Das comments in this context that one of the most conspicuous, if not unique, feature of Indian literary history is the uninterrupted continuation of the Rama theme for thousands of years in various forms. Certain components of the history, particularly the performing one, are completely lost, although the history of performances based on the themes from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata is shrouded in darkness. The history of their various literary incarnations and their function as the source of numerous literary works are based on solid evidences. If we see the history of Indian translation, we can find there were not only the manuscripts or the written translation or the oral tradition like telling stories, but or singing song. There were many more performative traditions, and all those performances had their own narrative of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and all these were the translation. All these came out through the process of translation, but gradually we lost it. Not only different written translations, but since the medieval era, Indian languages observed the Ramayana and the Mahabharata of different communities, like Jaina Ramayana, and of different forms, like the South Indian folk Ramayanas. Each modern Indian languages holds its community, culture, and ideology in the stories of local Ramayana and Mahabharata. And all of these texts are considered as creative poetic expression, not just mere translation. As for example, we can say about Bengali Ramayana of Krittibash, Kamban's Ramayana of Tamil, Sarala Das's Mahabharata in Odia, and Ejutasan's Ramayana in Malayalam language. Not only the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, but if we see the history of translation in pre-colonial India, we can find that many other texts of philosophy, many other texts of knowledge, and most significantly text of literature also had been translated into different Indian languages. And so let us talk something about the Sanskrit literature and in its other Indian renderings. There is a long history of reception and adaptation of Sanskrit poetry and Akhan, Kotha into different Indian languages. The list is too long. But among those innumerous literature, Kalidasha's Meghdut was very much popular to the poets of the later ages. A translation of Duta Kavyam was introduced later as a result of Kalidasha's reception in Bengali and other modern Indian languages. Beside his most loving text to the Indian poets and critics, Kalidasha's plays were also rendered in different languages like Avigyan Shakuntalam. Sanskrit, in spite of the language of elites, in spite of language not accessible to the common people, has its universal reception into modern Indian languages. Medieval translational culture was played a great role to bring the Sanskrit to the common people from the confine of Brahminical hegemonic space. There is a wide reception, translation and recreation of Sanskrit literature into different modern Indian languages. Gita Govinda, a famous Indian erotic, devotional and mystic poetic text, Kavya, originally written in Sanskrit, has been translated into modern Indian languages. Bhanudatta's Gito Gaurisha, which was written in 1320, Hira's Gita Shankara, Krishna Datta's Ihira Gauripati, which was written in 1649, and Hamshamani's Gita Digambara, which was written in 1655, and Kamala Lochana Khadgoraya's Gita Mukundo, which was written in 1790, are very few to mention among many texts influenced by Gita Govinda of Sanskrit literature. Gita Govinda created poets like Vidyapati of Maithili, Chandidas of Bengali, and Surdas of Hindi. So this text has such a wide and different kind of influence and reception on the later poets and their poetic creation. This is also a kind of translation. Almost all the medieval Oriya poets were taught the mantra of love and devotion from Jayadeva's Gita Govinda. Not only is that, but Gita Govinda also received as theme and spirit in most of the bhakti literature of medieval Borisha especially. Now, as I told earlier, that not only the Sanskrit literature or the Ramayana and Mahabharata, there was huge reception of the Purana or the Puranic text in Indian literature. Many of the Indian languages hold their own interpretation of Purana and they recreated the stories of the Purana. Now, let us talk about Purana and its translation in medieval Indian languages. Though all the Puranas have been translated into major Indian languages as well as English, only a few of them, principally the Vishnu Purana and the Bhagavatam, can safely be described as being widely known. Nonetheless, the stories told in the Puranas are part of the common currency, and in this respect, the Puranas can rightfully be spoken of as the scriptures of popular Hinduism. Maladhar Boshu translated some parts of Bhagavatam as Sri Krishna Vijaya in Bengali to rebuild Hindu identity in the Muslim-ruled Bengal. Many historians opines that. In his article called Alternative Modernities and Medieval Indian Literature, the Oriya Lakshmi Purana as Radical Pedagogy, Satyapi Mohanty says, in the early 1500s in Orissa, in eastern India, the saint mystic Achyutananda Das composes a short poem called Vipro Chalaka, which ends with a defiant philosophical question. A self-declared low caste or Shudra prophet of social change, Achyutananda directs the question to the Brahminical priestly and intellectual class or the Vipro gathered around the famed temple complex in Puri. Puri. Answer me, he demands, in the final couplet of a poem written in the vernacular in Oriya instead of the classical Sanskrit. I quote his question: does dharma derive from karma or karma from dharma? This incident proves the role of the Puranas in changing the social reality of caste oppression and its immense contribution to address the caste question in the society. Not only that, such kind of project translating Purana into modern Indian languages such as Oriya in medieval era involves the question of social oppression and addresses the caste question for the benefit of greater society. There were a very rich tradition of Puranic text into Tamil culture. Varagunarama Pandian 1560 to 1600 translated Linga Puranam and Vayu Samhita, and his brother Bharatungaram translated Brahmattarakhandam, and the younger brother Athivirama translated Kurma Puranam into Tamil. Tamil Puranas are divided into four categories: Mahapuranas, or the translated version of the Sanskrit Puranas; the epic Puranas, the stories drawn from Hindu mythologies; and the Sthala Puranas, or glorifying local shrines; and hagiographic Puranas, the stories of saints. Shishir Kumar Das, in his first volume of History of Indian Literature, says that another genre of literature that molded the medieval landscape of the medieval world as a group of texts, 18 in numbers, containing stories of gods and genealogies of the sages. According to Das, Puranas are a reservoir of stories from folk and other sources, and these are epical and encyclopedic in nature. This very nature of the Puranas made these texts to be rendered multiple times as multiple texts in different ages, in different languages of India. In Indian society, Sanskrit had very much a hegemonic role to play. It was a language of power, but not only Sanskrit. If we see the history of Indian languages or history of India, we can find that once Sanskrit was the language of power, Persian also was language of power, and then English was and is the language of power. So all these language of powers are the centers who reserve all the literary and philosophical knowledge, and those knowledge had to be translated from Sanskrit, Persian, or English, or the languages of power. And this is how we can find numerous translation from Sanskrit language into different Indian languages, and same kind of thing we can find from Persian language. So let us discuss about the Persian and the relation of Indian languages. Since the time of Islamic rule in India, gradually Persian became the language of the ruler. So it had superior position in the linguistic power structure. Persian literature no doubt offered a different kind of literary taste and forms. Persian even brought Hindus and Muslims together, as this language was primarily known as the language of the Islamic ruler, and Hindu elites also had to learn this for getting jobs in the royal court or under the sultans or nawabs. As this language appeared as the language of the learned society and the language of power as well, literary exchanges among Persian and other Indian languages also started to be happened easily. Tarachand commented that the Hindus reciprocated the compliment is well known. Persian and Urdu count many a Hindu votary who worshipped at their shrine. Chandravan Brahman, Anandram Mukhlis, Lakshmi Narayan Shafiq, Brindaban Das, Tekchand Bahar are only some of the Hindu writers of Persian. So far as Urdu is concerned, their name is legion. In this connection, it is noteworthy that throughout the Middle Age translations from Arabic and Persian into Sanskrit, and Hindi and vice versa were frequent. They constituted a powerful means of bringing the two communities together. In view of these facts, it is not surprising that the literature of Hindustani, Braj, and Awadhi show remarkable correspondences. In the development of Hindustani literary culture, Persian literary reception and influence played a key role. Tarachand further commented, among these poems, quite a number are apparently translations, either from Persian or from Hindi, but in fact, they are adaptations. Their style and manner are their own, and no one who reads them can say that they are not original, for their makers were skilled artists. Dara Shikoh, 1615 to 1659, Prince of Mughal Empire, was great believer of heterodoxy and he believed in communal harmony. He understood that the Hindus and Muslims both should know their religious philosophy, and these concessions bring a long-lived harmony among the communities. His erudite vision once materialized in praxis when he translated Upanishads into Persian language. When we talk about the medieval translation in India, the most crucial role was played by Bhakti movement. One side, this movement enriched the local, brought consciousness in the local about religion, philosophy and other knowledge, and in other side it actually enrich the literary culture, and this is how it becomes a heritage, and we all Indian have been carrying that legacy of Bhakti movement into some extent. So Bhakti movement actually initiated a huge culture of literary translation in medieval India. Though those translation was not only literary, most of the translation was performative, because they used to translate Veda, Upanishada, Purana in very simple version as mass can understand. People who do not have access to those high text can have access to their performative narratives. Bhakti movement from South India to the north, from western part of India to the Gangetic region spread widely over 12th to 18th centuries. Bhakti movement is responsible for developing literary culture into modern Indian languages, as I said. The term Bhakti itself explains Andrew Schelling in the introduction to his new anthology, first appeared in 2500 years ago in the Shweta Shvatara Upanishada and the Bhagavad Gita, indicating love or devotion directed to a deity or a god is Bhakti. Vishnu worshippers Alvara 6th to 9th century and the Shiva worshipper Nayanmara 5th to 10th century initiated this movement in South India, and which was gradually extended to the all over India. This movement had immense significance in the practice of translation in medieval Indian languages. The religious philosophies of the Veda, the Purana and other spiritual texts of ancient India were interpreted, recreated, reshaped by the saints, poet and gurus of the Bhakti movement in different languages. Through this movement, one side, lower caste people got their direct access to the religious philosophy, and the other side, it emancipates caste oppression to a greater extent. Difficult and complex theories of the Gita and many other religious texts were explained in very simple language by the poets and saints of the Bhakti movement. This movement created a whole lot of new philosophical texts, either in the form of manuscripts or in the form of different oral traditions. Translation in the form of simple poetry, simple songs and simple performances happened throughout the time of this movement. Chaitanya Dev in Bengal used to explain complex religious thoughts into simple language for the people who didn't have access to the Sanskrit or to the lower caste people. Kabir, Dadu, Tukaram, Mirabai, Surdas, all these poets and saints are very much prominent figures of this movement, and all of them were great translators of complex theory. Not only that, we can find multilingual text by the saints of this movement. As for example, we can say about Tukaram, who took birth in Maharashtra and traveled a lot through northern part of India and died in Punjab, created her abhangs in multiple languages. And there were existence of words from different language in his single musical text. Tulsidasa 1532 to 1623, one of the most influential figure of Bhakti movement and considered as the greatest poet of Hindi, translated Ramcharitmanasa and wrote Hanuman Chalisa, which a translation and adaptation of stories from the Ramayana. This tradition, especially Kabir, successfully brought a religious harmony through his religious practice. Both the Hindus and Muslims became close to each other as his disciple. Bhakti movement also had its great philosophical similarity with Sufism. Bhakti movement also observed growth of Sufism in India, which again brought a religious and poetic consciousness among both the Hindus and the Muslims. Poet Syed Alaul of Bengal translated Malik Muhammad Jaisi's Padmavat as Padmavati into Bangla. The text is considered as one of the most artistic and lucid expression of Sufism in a highly poetic form. Now let us conclude our discussion. This discussion shows that the medieval literary culture was very much dependent on the work of translation. Translation actually shaped the medieval literary system. One side, the translation among Indian languages in medieval era resistance against the Brahminical hegemony over society, language, literature, and knowledge as a whole, and it gave pace to the caste emancipation and found out intellectual path for caste emancipation. Translation in pre-colonial era used to travel from one pair of languages into another pair. It was not less diverse than the modern or contemporary translation. And most significant about pre-colonial translation is it involved greater community in their mind, which serves the intellectuality, serves the translation. The translation of this time was very much purposive act, and this translation culture was dedicated to the people across the classes. Translation had its own social, philosophical, and aesthetic objectives to fulfill. As the society was polyphonic, the texts were too. Hence, we get polyphonic text and knowledge for the people of different communities and culture during Bhakti movement. Translation in pre-colonial era was a social act and so deeply rooted within the society through addressing the social issues. Translation in medieval period appeared as inevitable to have greater knowledge, to get poetic pleasure, to fight against the religious, linguistic, and caste hierarchy. In pre-colonial Indian translation, translated text never seen as second-class citizen in literary culture. Translation also got similar kind of respect as the original, and translation was mostly creative and free in pre-colonial India. K. Sachidanandan rightly points out that original has never been specially privileged and the translator's position has never been secondary in India. So it is the result of colonization that the source text or source language got a hierarchical position in literary culture, and the well accepted and well practiced method of translating with all the freedoms also was gradually vanished, and word to word translation took its place, which was very much popular practice in Europe. And the last issue is the pre-colonial translation practice can be understood as most authentic translation practice and method in India. If we like to write the history of concepts on Indian translation, or if we want to find the theory of Indian translation, then the pre-colonial translation can help us most. And modern Indian languages or Indian bhasha got its flow to create literature in it. Though through pre-colonial translation, bhasha got enriched, bhasha got confidence, and bhasha got knowledge. Thank you.